being vulnerable and talking about your failures as well as your successes is going to be really critical for the next generations to understand what goes into maintaining wealth. Not everything is going to work out. Everybody faces failures. Everybody faces challenges. And how do you work through that? I also think, quite frankly, regardless of what your financial wealth is, what is your legacy in terms of your sense of meaning and purpose?
For the first time in 2025, ultra-high net worth families have ranked legacy in their top 3 priorities. My guest today has spent her career studying the thing that actually builds it, family stories. Welcome to Visionary Advisor. I'm Alex Kirby, the founder of Total Family. What is the point of family stories? Why do my kids need to know where I grew up or how I met my wife? Turns out the answer is resilience. Dr. Robyn Fivush is a psychologist at Emory University and one of the researchers behind the Do You Know scale, 20 questions that turn out to be a better predictor of a child's resilience than family income or parental education. Let's find out the secrets and importance of family stories with Dr. Fivush. Dr. Robyn Fivush, it's wonderful to have you on Visionary Advisor. Thank you for making time.
I'm happy to be here, Alex. It's wonderful to talk about this with you and with all of the families you work with.
I think that the best place to start is what you're probably most known for, the Do You Know scale. Can you tell us a little bit about that amazing thing that is that the most exciting thing in your career? Like, is that thing you're most proud of?
I would say it's gotten the most public attention, and it's been a lot of fun to be able to take that out to the world and talk about it and why that's important and why family storytelling is so important. So that scale came out of a study that we did, my colleague and I, Marshall Duke, probably 25 years ago now, maybe even longer. There was a lot of data coming out at that time that families that ate dinner together had children, adolescents, and young adults who were doing better on all kinds of measures, academic measures, social measures, emotional measures, etc. But nobody knew exactly what it was about having family dinner together. Marshall and I were really interested, both of us. He is a clinical psychologist who had worked with families that perhaps were not having open and trusting conversations as much, and me working as a developmental psychologist with more typical families. Both thought that one of the things that we both saw in our observations was that families that talked a lot about their experiences together had kids who seemed to be doing much better. Family stories. So we thought we should figure out what's going on around the dinner table. Is it family stories? So we just tape recorded a whole bunch of typical families having Tuesday night spaghetti dinner and looked at what they talked about, which, as you might imagine, is a very messy way to start observing because families talk to each other, with each other, over each other.
So when you approach families about this, can I just tape record your dinners? What is that like? Were people just, yeah, sure, you can, of course.
We had a lot of buy-in. We recruit. These are people who, at that time, I'm trying to remember, we recruited through mostly institutions, schools, religious institutions. This is before 2000, right? It's 1999, 2000. So these are families who said, I'd like to hear more about your research. What are you doing? And this was actually, it turned out to be a long-term study. These families gave us remarkable access to their homes, to their stories over several years.
Okay, so you're tape recording all these families, and then what happens?
We're trying to figure out what's going on over these family dinner time conversations. And we were not surprised to discover that over a typical dinner, Tuesday night, Thursday night, whether you're eating McDonald's takeout or fried chicken or whatever it is, stories come up all the time. Most of those stories are stories that weave the family back together at the end of the day. What happened at school today? How was your math test? But also a lot about what the parents were doing. Guess who I had lunch with? You won't believe this story from work. So that the kids are also being introduced into an adult world that they don't have access to. And that's important. It's not just kids telling their parents about their world, it's parents telling their kids about the adult world. Most of the stories are those kinds of stories, but a substantial number of stories blend into that's like the time we went to the beach last summer, or remember when we went to grandma's house last Thanksgiving. And then those often merge into and or that's like when I was in high school. That's like when I was your age. So the parent telling a story about when they were growing up, or something about when their parents were growing up. So that's what we call the family history stories, the intergenerational narratives. Stories in general come up all the time. Stories account for 40% of human conversation. But that includes this, what'd you do today? What'd you do last week? But these intergenerational narratives come up less frequently, but again, in a typical dinner, which takes maybe 30 to 40 minutes, most families will refer to an intergenerational story a couple of times, some more than others. And one of the things that we discovered, we were not surprised that the stories mattered. We were more surprised that it was these intergenerational stories that carried a lot of the predictability. That those families in which these intergenerational stories came up in conversation had adolescents who were doing better on virtually every measure we had.
Mm. It's interesting. There's a quote I love that perspective has an expiration date. I have little kids. Sometimes when I'm telling them stories, I can see them processing that I was little. They just don't realize that some of the stuff that they're feeling, and I forget that I felt it. I don't really know what it's like to be an 11-year-old who's really nervous about something anymore. Your research just like checks out with what feels like makes sense to me when you're talking to these two young people, for them to understand that you weren't just born this like seemingly decently functioning adult, that you went through a lot of this stuff too.
You bring up a really important point about timing, both timing in terms of the child's age, developmental timing, and also timing in terms of when particular stories might come up in conversation. So you're absolutely right, Alex. Very little kids are not yet that interested in hearing stories about when their parents were growing up. They want to hear stories about when their parents were their age. So a 4-year-old might be interested in when you were a little kid, but they're not going to be interested in what happened when you were in high school or college.
Yeah.
So there's that developmental matching, which becomes really important as a kid moves into adolescence and young adulthood. But there's also when stories are important, particularly difficult or challenging stories. And that's often when the child is facing some problem. I don't know exactly how old your boys are, but we have a charming example from one of our families, a little girl, and we all use pseudonyms, of course, in this work. So this is a little girl we've given the name April to. And April lost her favorite storybook, and they think they left it at school. So they're having this conversation, the mother and April having this conversation about how sad April is that she left her book at school. She's 4 years old, and she says to her mother, "Did you ever lose anything?"
Mm.
And her mother kind of takes a breath and says, "Yes, I lost my favorite lip gloss when I was about your age. And we left it in a store, and I was just crying and crying." And April gets all involved in this conversation. "Did you find it? What happened?" And it was very reassuring to April that her mother both had been a little girl and had lost something and found it.
Yeah.
So it was emotionally challenging. It's a small example of an emotional challenge for a young child. But these small moments of coping teach you lessons for how to cope with the larger problems that unfortunately are bound to happen as we grow older.
Yeah. When we're talking to wealth advisors and they're working with their clients, we hear it's a different version of this, but it's, let's just pretend that your dad is Jeff Bezos or something, right? You're looking at your dad as a little kid, you're not really aware of everything that's going on. And then all you're seeing is a put together successful person. You don't see the trials and tribulations and the ups and downs and the bad days and all of that. And I think it's hard for sometimes the parents to they want to tell all the good stuff, but they don't always want to talk about some of the other stuff. And it turns out that some of the other stuff it seems like it's really what helps people. Is that fair? Like the harder stuff?
Absolutely critical.
Yeah.
Your thought is exactly right. Parents might be nervous about telling certain kinds of stories, particularly stories that might put them in a not so great light because they
Right.
did something that they're now maybe regret, or maybe even something, a transgression. They told a lie or they cheated. And it's like, do I tell my child about that? The answer is yes and no. I mean,
Right.
you don't want to tell that story like all the time.
Yeah, sure.
This comes down to the power of why intergenerational stories are such a powerful predictor of child outcome and adolescent and young adult outcome. Children, adolescents, young adults are still developing the resources, the ability to cope with things that are challenging to them, times that they try and fail, times that they can't do what they thought they were going to be able to do. These kinds of experiences build a sense of perseverance, of resilience, if you can work through them. But if you don't have the models to work through them, you're stuck. So these intergenerational narratives provide those kinds of models. I get it. I know where you are. I've been in a situation like that. I have failed. I have done something that I'm not quite happy about. Maybe even I did something I'm ashamed of. I talked behind my girlfriend's back. It was nasty and I so regret it now. So I get what you're feeling. And here's how I worked through it. So it's not an abstract, this is what you should do. It's a concrete, lived experience that matters, that has meaning, and that actually provides a kind of roadmap for how you get through these things in life. But I don't want to downplay the positive stories, because those are important too. You want to have lots of stories where you're laughing and having joy together and creating bonds and feeling close. Those are important too.
I do feel like it checks out, if you think about any movie or story that has resonated with, the larger collective, that people would just say, this is an unbelievable story. People have loved it for hundreds of years. It's never, this person's perfect and things are going well and they continue going well, right? It's always a transformation of the person through the experience that they had that they didn't know they were going to get out of, some version of the hero. But I'm thinking of another example. I started playing hockey when I was 4. And the first time I went on the ice, I cried. My mom was like, he doesn't have to play if he doesn't want to. And my dad said I had to do it. And my 4-year-old, we put him on the ice for the first time. And I told him that story on the way to hockey. I was like, the first time I played hockey, I cried. And he's like, what? When my dad came to town, he asked my dad about when I cried. This story has stayed with him. And like when I took him off the ice, he's like, I didn't even cry like you did. It was like this, and I'm sort of connecting it now in real time because I hadn't really thought of that story. I didn't get in the car planning on telling him that story. I was sort of just like thinking about what he was feeling. And I was like, oh my God, I remember wanting to come off the ice and my mom telling me it was okay. And my dad like slamming the door and being like, go finish practice. And I played hockey my whole life. I have so many amazing experiences that came from getting through that little bump in the road.
That's a great example, but I do want to say one thing. Sometimes these difficult stories don't have a positive resolution. Not everything,
That's fair.
Unfortunately, not everything in life, not all lemons can be made into lemonade. And if you try to do that, it can feel false and inauthentic. Sure. Sometimes just sad things happen. A grandparent dies, a beloved family pet, you're ill. Maybe you learn something from it, but it's not the same as picking yourself up and learning positive strengths and a silver lining. But what we do learn from that is hard times happen and you get through them and you share them, and that makes the burden easier. And you move on. And this is why the positive stories are important. Those aren't the only things that happen in life. Into every life some rain must fall, but there's lots and lots of daisies.
On the do you know scale, which we'll link it below, on the do you know scale, if you're not familiar, it's Dr. Fivush and Dr. Duke. The first question, do you know how your parents met, where your mother grew up, where some of your grandparents grew up? It's a lot of questions like this. There's just a couple of fun ones towards the end. But the temptation might be for someone to see this list and say, oh, I'm going to go answer all these questions. And I think you and I just want to point out that that isn't what you were trying to do here, right?
Exactly right. So going back to that first study of the dinner time families where we started to get really intrigued by these intergenerational narratives, we were really interested in how these kinds of stories come up in conversation, how they're told, which matters, the perspective that they're told with matters. But from that, we also wanted to develop a way of getting kind of a blunt index of the extent to which this family might be a storytelling family. So what the do you know scale measures is not do you know this information, but the more of these stories you know, and we've mapped this out, the more you come from a family that tells stories on a regular basis. Because how else would you know this stuff? It's not knowing facts. And what's really also important, and you mentioned this in your story about talking about your first hockey experience with your son, is that the child understands that it's your experience and takes your perspective in that experience. My dad cried. He was upset, but I wasn't. So that's a differentiation. Or maybe, and I was upset too. That's okay also. But kids who take the perspective of their parent, and that's a skill that only really develops in adolescence and adulthood, those are the stories that really, really resonate. So again, it's not just knowing facts. It's having these stories and identifying with these stories. That's like me.
And now, right after you do this, there is a large global scale event that allows you to go even deeper into your research and findings, right?
Yes. So unfortunately, or fortunately, we started the research before 9/11, and it was a longitudinal study that we had launched. So we were able to go back to the family. We had seen them 2 years before 9/11, and also I think we saw them one time intervening, but the first time we saw them was 2 years before 9/11, 1999. And then, of course, 9/11 happened, which was totally devastating. People didn't know how to cope with this. What did this mean? And in particular, we were working mostly with families with adolescents and young adults at that time. They were really struggling with what this meant for who they were as a community member, as an American, as a global citizen, etc. What we discovered is that the families who had previously, before 9/11, been storytelling families, and the adolescents who knew more of their family stories were coping better following 9/11. And that was after controlling for multiple other factors that might predict coping skills following a devastating event. And we've now replicated that, not with something as worldwide catastrophic. Well, actually, we've replicated it with COVID-19 to some extent.
I feel like there's a lot going on with COVID that we don't totally understand yet either.
That storytelling families produce kids who are more resilient to both the personal traumas and to social traumas, societal traumas.
I love the findings because Sometimes the question we get from families is no one cares about our stories. What is the point of telling these stories? And to me, your findings creating resiliency in your families, it's like, that's what we're trying to do here, right? So do you feel like that's a fair response?
I do outreach to parent groups, religious groups, and even the families that we do our research with. They always like, I wish I could tell my teenager or my young adult my stories, but they roll their eyes. They're not interested. Well, we've interviewed hundreds of adolescents through our research, and probably because other people are now doing this kind of research, there's thousands of adolescents and young adults who have been interviewed. And well over 90% of them know stories about their parents when their parents were growing up, something about their family. You almost never get an adolescent who doesn't. You get a lot of adolescents who say things like, I wish I knew more.
Yeah.
So in some of our studies, we get the adolescent, well, in all of our studies, we ask for the stories, but we'll take the story that the adolescent gives us. Let's say, a 16-year-old girl tells us a story about her mother growing up when her mother won the swimming championship. And then we'll go back to the mom and we'll say, your daughter told me this story. And the mother is always amazed. She did? I didn't even think she was listening. She was like walking out of the room when I was telling that story.
Yeah.
Because they're adolescents, they're young adults. So they look like they're not listening or they look like they're not interested, but they are listening. They know these stories and they want to know these stories. The other thing is, and I want to get back to timing, stories are going to be remembered when they're told at the right time, when they mean something to the person you're telling them to. And the other thing, particularly about these interactional stories, they're not always told in their entirety at a sitting. It's not like, sit down and let me tell you the story of how your father and I met. It comes up in bits and pieces. It gets filled in over time, in bits of conversation. If you think about the conversations you had maybe with your romantic partner or with your best friend, you know a lot about their history. You know a lot of their stories. But that came through years of casual conversation where bits and pieces were told here and there. Sometimes the whole story gets told at once.
Sure.
But a lot of times it just gets told kind of on an as-needed basis, so to speak, as it makes conversational sense.
What about stories? Should we think about them the same way? Like if I was telling the story of my grandparents to my son, it's not my story. I'm sort of getting it, from my dad or from my grandfather. And it's about when my grandfather, this happened to him when he was 6 years old. Is that different?
Yes and no. I mean, yes, of course it's different. I think the most powerful kind of story is what I would call a lived experience story. I'm telling you what I actually experienced, what I was thinking, what I was feeling, and you're hearing it from my lips, so to speak. But that's not always the case, and it's not always possible. So these more one-step removed stories, what's sometimes called vicarious stories, are still very powerful. They can still be models. So yes, they matter, but again, it's that interaction. However, the exception to that is going to be grandparents telling their grandkids stories about the parent, right? So G1 telling G3 about G2.
Okay.
Because they tell stories about the parent that the parent wouldn't tell.
Right. Yeah. So what is it? Is that good or bad?
I think it's good. There's a sense in which it bonds the family together. It's like, oh, my mom and my grandmother also had this problematic relationship.
Sure.
And my mother did these things that she probably shouldn't have done and is never going to tell me about.
Yeah.
So it creates more of an identification.
Right.
Again, developmentally appropriate. There are some stories.
I was going to say, yeah.
There are some stories you probably don't want to tell, but other stories, even frankly, very, very difficult stories. We have, in our corpus, and again, it's, hundreds and hundreds of adolescents. So you get all kinds of stories. We have stories where the mother had a teenage pregnancy. That's probably not something you want to tell a 9-year-old.
Right.
But a 17-year-old?
Sure.
And how do you talk about it? And And how did the grandparents react, and etc. So there are a lot, or first marriage sometimes that, you don't talk about till later. Not a blended family, but where there was a brief first marriage. And then this couple got together and had this family, and now they're telling stories to their children. We've seen that. Also, frankly, traumatic stories, if one of the parents saw combat or some kind of an abusive relationship. There are dark stories, and those you have to think more carefully about how and when you share them. There's the everyday challenges. There's the expected challenges. They're the challenges you learn from. But there are also some very, very dark experiences, and those you have to be a little bit more cautious about how and where you share them.
I referenced when we were talking earlier about the work of Jay Hughes in our pre-episode communication, and one of the forms of family capital is intellectual capital, which is the shared knowledge of the family. The thing that I think is really cool about your work and all the stuff that you're saying is a lot of times when we're working with multi-generational families and they talk about family history, they'll say, oh, here's the book we had made, but no one's read it, right? No one's read this book. If you ask the people these questions, they don't have answers. And when Jay refers to shared knowledge, I think the important thing in your work and what he's saying is it's the exchange that happens between the two human beings of teaching, receiving, communicating back, asking questions. It's not just paying someone, to look through records and create a living version of your family. It's the act of sharing between multiple generations. There's room for both, by the way, right? You can still have both. But if you just create a book that no one ever reads and no one talks and communicates about any of this stuff, I don't think that's what you're saying. And so I just love that your research focuses so much just on the process of how families exchange these stories.
Thank you. But I think exactly what you said is right. Both are important in different ways. So leaving the curated legacy of the family stories, I do think that's important. And people may or may not dip into it if and when they need it. But if it's not there, it's not a resource to be dipped into. I would never say that's not important. But I do know what the empirical data show is that it's that interactive, conversational sharing of stories. And what's really interesting is, so we do our research in two ways. We have the family talk about their stories together, but then we also do one-on-one interviews with adolescents and or parents about the stories they know. When we do the families together, even the intergenerational stories are collaboratively told. They're not just told from the parent to the child. The child is adding bits and pieces either because they've heard the story before.
Okay.
So that they're reconstructing it together, or they're adding bits of, I get it. I'm like that too. So it's that give and take that really creates that sense of this is how the world works. This is how the world works for me. This is how I make sense of things.
Robyn, can we talk about the narrative types that you created? Because I think this will speak to the advisors and the families around. Just tell us the three types and then maybe what you learned about them, please.
So let me first give real credit to my collaborator, Marshall Duke. Marshall really is the architect of this aspect of the research, but I can talk about it. So now we're talking about the kinds of stories that families tell about the whole shape of their family history. This is the kind of family we are. We've had these kinds of experiences. So it's not about any specific story, but kind of, what was your grandfather's life like? What was your father's life like? And there seem to be, not surprisingly, particularly given what we know about stories, three types of stories. There's what's called the ascending story. Things were bad, we worked hard, and everything got better.
Okay.
There's the descending story, maybe wherever you start from. Things were bad, things were good, but they're not good now. We lost everything in the stock market and we'll never recover. Obviously, that's not a good story to share.
But you know what? The version of that in intergenerational wealth is like our grandfather made all the money and we've been screwing it up ever since. That's like a version
Well,
of what
that's
of
a
descending.
descending story.
Yeah. So that's real.
Yeah.
It might not be we lost everything, but that's a real story that gets told. Like, we'll never do better than what we were 3 generations ago. So, okay.
The oscillating story is a story of resilience. These are the stories that really are the most powerful kinds of family stories. And it's related to what we've already been talking about. You start from someplace, good or bad, wherever. Let's say we're talking about financial wealth, the rags to riches story. My story, my grandfather came as an Eastern European immigrant as a child, didn't even make it, had to drop out of school at age 13 to make money on the streets to help support his family, and ended up building a very successful business. By the time he died, he was a successful businessman, certainly financially, and in terms of family relationships and love, right? Yet within that, that's an ascending story. It's a rags to riches. But I can tell you lots of stories about my grandfather and or my grandparents when times were tough. When they were first married, they were doing okay, and then the Depression hit. So they talk about how they were driven back into poverty and having to work out of poverty again. There were some family issues. There were some illnesses. There were some difficulties. There was the loss of loved ones. Those are sprinkled in the family story. So it's an oscillating story. It doesn't just ascend. It goes back and forth. We faced challenges, but we overcame. But you don't overcome once and for all, forever and ever. There's always challenges. There's always resources to help you build the resilience to overcome.
I think this is also just really interesting because young people are having such a hard time right now.
Yes.
When we talk to their parents about some of this stuff, sometimes it's like, well, how did you get through your hard times? We'll hear people, that's when I learned to read all the time and I can get lost in a book because it helps clear my mind. Or that's when I started journaling to get these ideas out of my head. Whatever it is, whatever some of those things were that got through that. And when you ask if you've ever shared any of that, almost always we hear the answer is no. And I think just like, again, this really reaffirms what we just see anecdotally of it's really important for people to understand that you struggled when you were a young high school student too. And you struggled when you didn't find your job or you got fired. If a family is struggling to get to their oscillating narrative or weave in some of those things, do you have any ideas as to how they could tell some of those dips in the story a little easier?
Yeah. I want to preface that by saying I think parenting values, of course, change over time as well. And I think we're living through a time, particularly because a lot of these young adults lived through COVID at a very developmentally vulnerable time.
Uh-huh.
And I think a lot of parents feel like, I need to protect my child. And that protection means keeping all the bad things at bay, never letting there be monsters hiding under the bed.
Right.
And that's partly true. We do want to protect our children. We don't want them to confront all the horror and harshness of the world at once. But we have to let that horror and harshness in pieces because they are going to face it. And if they don't have any knowledge or resources to face the small things, they're never going to have the ability to face the big things. And there's no way you can protect anybody from everything.
Yeah.
My main message to parents is you don't necessarily want to throw your kid into the deep end of the pool, but you don't necessarily want to keep them wearing floaties for the rest of their life. Right?
Yeah.
Right. You kind of want to
right.
be somewhere in the middle. And again, it comes back to being vulnerable yourself, being willing to share your own stories of failure, of challenge, maybe even unresolved. I never was able to figure out how to do that. And I just had to move on. Or this is how, I dealt with it. You also don't want to be, I loved my grandfather, don't get me wrong, but his stories were, I walked uphill to school in the snow barefoot both ways.
Sure.
That's not true either.
Yeah.
It's not like you have no idea how hard I worked and suffered so that you could have a good life. That's probably not the best tone to take either. It really is one of, we're a family. We love each other. We support each other. But there's going to be hard times. And we should talk about it. We should talk about the hard times each of us has faced and how we think about it, how we feel about it, how we coped with it. And we should allow for the fact that that may happen again, even if we're enjoying the moment now. Again, while totally reveling in the joy. Right? I don't think everything should be a bring down, but I do think that acknowledgement and validation of hard times is critically important. Dismissing whether your child is 3 and throwing a temper tantrum because they can't have their crayons, or they're 30 and they're upset because their career isn't going well. You always start with a validation of feelings. I understand you're angry. There can be a but you have to validate the feelings. And you have to, showing you understand them with a concrete story is immensely helpful.
We work with a storyteller, an author named Matthew Dix. He wrote a book called Storyworthy. I think he's like the best storyteller I've ever heard. And he talks about just mining your life for stories. And one of the things I think is my takeaway from this is the timeliness of the story. So make sure you're capturing the story in some way. Think about the story, but use it in a timely place, right? So if I had thought about crying before I played hockey, maybe there's a really good time to use that story, like in the car on the way to hockey. And then there's a time where it has no relevance and it's not going to connect. And if I remember the story and then I forget it, or I don't make a note of it or something, that's kind of like what Matthew was saying. But I think like the timeliness of these stories, because maybe you think of something, you're like, oh man, that is a really important moment of my life. That doesn't necessarily mean I run into the living room and start telling everyone about it. Maybe that's just something I keep until the right time.
I think there's several really important points in what you just said. One is, and I hear this all the time, I'm not a good storyteller. When we talk about family storytelling, we're not necessarily talking about the really great story. That is the story that has this fabulous, narrative arc, beginning, middle, end. Everybody loves listening to it. You're rapt attention. No. There are those kinds of family stories. Often they're told at holiday dinners. They're the story that has to be told every single year. They're great. They're wonderful stories. But most family storytelling, again, as I said, told in bits and pieces. That's like when I was in high school and I had a fight with my friend. Oh, yeah, we fought about the fact that I felt like she had broken a promise to me, and I never really explained to her how I felt, and I've always regretted it. That's enough of a story.
Sure.
Right? You don't need a big story. You need snippets, what are often called small stories. I do think the big stories are also interesting. I also think being intentional. That is, people say, I don't tell stories. Actually, you do. If you look back, we've been talking for 45 minutes. We've probably told a dozen stories to each other already. That's just what people do. It's human conversation, all human conversation. 40% stories. Not necessarily, again, those fabulous rapt attention stories, but sharing a piece of yourself, sharing a piece of somebody's history. So my advice to parents is always, one, don't worry about it being a fabulously great story. Definitely be intentional. Look for moments rather than just telling your child what to do or what not to do. Think about, why am I telling them that? Do I understand how they're feeling? Do I have a concrete story that I can share about my own experience to connect with them? And the third is, don't worry if you don't get to finish the story. Don't worry if they roll their eyes, because in fact, what the research shows is they are listening and they are hearing them and they want the stories.
What did you learn about the storyteller of the family? Who is that?
So there are gender differences in family storytelling in two ways. One, women, again, a lot of our work is with heterosexual couples. So I'm going to generalize to that. Women tend to be the family historians. That is, they are the ones who tend to keep what we think of as a family history. Often it's in the form of the family Bible or a family religious document that records births, deaths, marriages. So they're literally the history keepers.
Right.
They're also around the dinner table or around wherever you are when you're telling these stories, whether it's in the car or at a picnic table or wherever. It tends to be the mothers who ask most of the questions, the open-ended questions, to keep the story going, to keep it more collaborative. Fathers often add as much information to the story, but mothers are the ones who seek everybody's input more often than fathers do. This is frequency. It's not that fathers don't do this.
Sure,
and it's not that fathers are really play a major role. And when women tell their own stories, they tend to tell stories that have more emotional content and have more relationship content than when men tell their stories.
That checks out. I mean, when my wife tells a story, it's always about the people. Sometimes you don't even know where the story is taking place. I'm like, our flight left at this time. We arrived at this location. We drove in a minivan. She's like, we had all the boys and, all the stuff. And so that checked out for me. It's interesting. The reason I brought it up is because 7 out of 10 women switch financial advisors after their husband passes away. And one of the reasons we think is that they're just not building connection with the other spouse. The husband might be the one who's like, oh, here's what we're doing on the investment side, blah, blah, blah. But I think that just there's something here in terms of making sure you're connecting with the entire family. If you're having meetings without the female spouse in a heterosexual couple, like as you're saying, you don't have the storyteller in the meeting. You don't have the family historian in the meeting who's seeing a whole different perspective of how these events took place. And as you're also saying, pulling out the other people's perspective so it isn't just one voice that is speaking about the events and cascading them down. So I just thought that was a really interesting finding of your work as well.
It is interesting.
So let's end on this. Do you have any advice for a financial advisor or somewhat, think through the lens of a financial advisor? They're working with all these families. Now they read your work, they listen to it. Now they know how important storytelling is. What should they do?
I think helping families to tell their story is really important. And I think for wealthy families, that means a couple of things. One is, particularly for families that are building wealth, the story of the one who builds the wealth can be one of, I worked so hard and now your obligation. I don't want to say guilt necessarily, but, I'm leaving this to you. You have to, look how hard I worked. Look what I sacrificed.
Yeah.
That is not necessarily going to be a positive story of resilience for the next couple of generations. I also think being vulnerable and talking about your failures as well as your successes is going to be really critical for the next generations to understand what goes into maintaining wealth, that not everything is going to work out. Everybody faces failures, everybody faces challenges, and how do you work through that? I also think, quite frankly, regardless of what your financial wealth is, what is your legacy in terms of your sense of meaning and purpose? So now I want to turn to why it's important for you to tell your story. We've been talking about why it's important for the kids to hear these stories, mostly kids, adolescents, young adults. That's where most of the research is. I think it continues to be important as people enter middle age to hear stories from their elders, from their parents, and they're lucky enough to still have grandparents. But it's also very beneficial for the storytellers. Developmentally, we are always dealing with who are we? Who am I? Who do I want to be? What are my values? What do I want out of my life? Particularly in adulthood, we can talk about 2 stages. One is, the midlife crisis. You've heard all about it. But it's really not so much a crisis as a shift in thinking about your past and your future. It's a way of thinking about, I had all of these plans, and maybe now, if you're fortunate, you find yourself in a stable relationship. Maybe you have kids, you have a career. It's kind of like, okay, now what? What is my legacy? What am I going to leave behind me? It's what's called generativity. What will be left of me when I'm gone? And then as we get even older, and I can talk about this because I'm entering this phase, when we enter the elderly phase, the future is much shorter than the past. And you just naturally begin to engage in what's called life review. What have I done? Has it been meaningful? Have I lived a life of integrity? So for adults, for middle-aged adults and into older adulthood, telling their story and helping them to shape a story where they understand what their legacy is and how generative they've been, whether it be through parenting, through mentoring, through teaching, through building a company, through philanthropic, whatever it is, that you've been generative and that you're leaving a legacy and that they've lived a life of integrity. So for middle-aged and elderly adults who are able to tell their story in this way, they show a much higher sense of well-being. They show a sense of meaning and purpose in life.
I could not agree more. When we're talking about legacy letters or telling these family stories, sometimes we'll say, even if no one ever reads it, it will change you. It changes you as you're reflecting on these things and you're thinking about your life. I love that term, life review. I love that. It changes you and it makes you better able to go forward with more clarity or more peace of mind. Dr. Fivush, thank you so much for your work, for coming on. And you're still writing at Psychology Today, right? Can we still read your work there?
Absolutely. I'm still writing Psychology Today blogs as well as other things. So yes, I am remaining active. That is an important part of my identity and legacy.
Of course. Please keep writing and we'll keep reading. Thank you so much for your time.
Alex, thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
That's it for Visionary Advisor. Thank you to our guest and to Total Family, whose software is helping advisors do legacy better. If you're a fan of Visionary Advisor, please subscribe and share it with another top-notch wealth advisor like yourself, and we'll see you next time.